So welcome, good afternoon. I'm Dr. Larry Lewis, a researcher at CNA. On behalf of our President and CEO, Catherine McGrady, I'd like to welcome you to today's National Security Seminar Spotlight. Today, we're exploring the intersection of artificial intelligence with the extremely high stakes of nuclear operations and what can be done to mitigate risk. So before we begin, a few administrative notes. We are recording this event, and we'll make it available on our site as well as on YouTube. And if you'd like to access it afterwards, either for yourself or to share with a colleague, we will send out a link as soon as it's available. Okay. After our opening and panelist remarks, we'll spend the rest of this session with question and answers from our audience. So we encourage you to send in your questions. If you're participating through Zoom, please send in questions through the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. If you're calling in, you can send them through email, and our address is CNA_NSS@cna.org. So before we move to our panelists, I'd like to give a bit of background regarding CNA. We're a nonprofit research organization that contains both the Center for Naval Analyses and the Institute for Public Research. The Center for Naval Analyses is a federally funded research and development corporation center for the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, and we support decision makers across the Department of Defense. Our Institute of Public Research supports civilian agencies in a wide range of areas, including Homeland Security, infrastructure protection, digital transformation, emerging technologies, public health response and preparedness, and emergency operations. So CNA's National Security Seminar brings together thought leaders from across the U.S. government, academia, research organizations, the private sector, and U.S. partner nations. The idea is to share expertise, facilitate discussions, and contribute to dialogues on issues that are deeply important to U.S. national security. The theme for this year is confronting shared challenges to national security in a decisive decade. Let's see, maybe move this a little more. Hopefully that helps. Okay. So the term shared challenges occurs 29 times in the 2022 National Security Strategy across a number of different issues. As the National Security Strategy makes clear, U.S. policymakers and defense planners will increasingly need to take a cooperative response to shared challenges to be effective in the midst of a long-term conflict or contest with geopolitical competitors. So in this series so far this year, we've talked about the use of drones in the war in Ukraine, talked about critical mineral supply chains, talked about protests and the regime crackdown in Iran. We talked about the 20th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, and most recently, nuclear cooperation with strategic competitors. So that brings us to our topic today. As we consider our topic of artificial intelligence and nuclear operations, it's a timely topic with the recent release of AI-enabled tools such as ChatGPT and GPT-4. These tools remind us that AI can do remarkable things. It's possible to interact with some of these from an individual level and think that they can do anything. But when we dig deeper, we can find that there are flaws and there are risks. We find risk of bias. There are unexpected and frankly wrong outputs. There's brittleness. So these systems need to operate within their design scope and their conditions. We also see that they're vulnerable to tampering and malicious attacks. There's also a tendency for humans to make mistakes. We can overtrust these systems. We can also misunderstand what they're really doing under the hood, right? So they're powerful, but there are flaws and risks. And then we consider applying these AI applications to nuclear operations. How should we think about applying these powerful but limited and vulnerable AI technologies to nuclear operations? A mission with the highest stakes and with applications that simply cannot afford to fail. What should we do as responsible states and militaries? And then going back to the theme of shared challenges, how should we be working on these issues in a cooperative, collective way? We will tackle these questions today. So I'd now like to introduce our distinguished speaker who will provide introductory remarks. Assistant Secretary Mallory Stewart is the Secretary for the Bureau of Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance at the U.S. Department of State. Secretary Stewart was formerly a special assistant to President Biden and the Senior Director for Arms Control, Disarmament, and Non-Proliferation at the National Security Council. Prior to joining NSC, she was a Senior Manager for Global Nuclear Security and Non-Proliferation at the Center for Global Security and Cooperation at Sandia National Laboratories. And there she helped lead Sandia's Cooperative Monitoring Center in its efforts to facilitate scientific engagement for global security. And Secretary Stewart has a AB from Harvard and a JD from Stanford Law School. Assistant Secretary, we are thrilled to have you today, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic.
Thank you so much, Tim, and good afternoon, everyone. I need to begin by thanking CNA for organizing and running this event and express my appreciation for all of your work on this important Arms Control Bureau funded project. Really looking forward to hearing the panel discussion and the questions that come. So, of course, emerging and disruptive technologies will transform the international security environment. The Biden-Harris administration recognized the challenges and opportunities that the application of these technologies to national defense will pose to peace and security. This transformation could create new domains of strategic competition, at least as consequential as the innovations in computing and telecommunications of the late 20th century. Advancements in artificial intelligence, or AI, will fundamentally alter militaries around the world, large and small. Every day in Ukraine, we see uses of AI that could shape the future of arms conflict. These range from how Ukrainian soldiers process data and analyze the situation on the battlefield to how Ukraine's population accesses the internet and the broader community. Our strategic competitors also recognize the significance of this transformation and are striving to develop and apply these new technologies to gain a military edge. The People's Republic of China is making significant investments in emerging technologies such as AI and quantum information science, and its strategy of military-civil fusion aims to harvest dual-use advanced and emerging technologies to achieve global economic and perhaps military dominance. Meanwhile, Russia is using its brutal war of aggression against Ukraine, as it did with its involvement in the Syrian civil war, as an opportunity to test new capabilities and tactics, all too often resulting in harm to civilians and civilian infrastructure. Against this backdrop, we're seeing the rapid emergence and evolution of powerful AI capabilities. And there are lively debates over where these trends are headed. And for my bureau, the potential for AI capabilities to impact strategic stability is not an academic question. We must anticipate these impacts and act proactively, taking advantage of the opportunities and addressing the risks to ensure the United States can harness the benefits of emerging technologies safely and effectively. And that requires us to understand the trajectory of technologies and their potential applications across military and civilian sectors to help us determine what arms control and risk reduction tools could enhance our security and preserve peace. Unfortunately, we have, and fortunately, actually, we have a funding capacity in the ABC Bureau's Verification Assets Fund to support this kind of important research, including this crucial study by CNA. So the study on the nexus of AI and nuclear operations is extremely timely. New AI models are shattering expectations and raising questions about what these capabilities might be used for in the future. And it's hard to keep up with the developments in AI just over the past month. And nowhere are the potential implications more significant than in the application of AI capabilities in the nuclear domain. I want to highlight several of the major concerns the study reveals regarding states' potential application of AI to their nuclear operations. First, AI capabilities could exacerbate existing cybersecurity risks and introduce new vulnerabilities into nuclear operations, vulnerabilities that are unique to AI systems. Then there are the challenges with the interface between machines and human operators, such as how to ensure human operators understand and have appropriate levels of confidence in the AI systems themselves. Even more complex are the implications of AI-enabled capabilities for decision-making. Many of us have seen reporting and are familiar with the problems of AI systems internalizing human errors and biases. Flawed assumptions or data baked in to AI capabilities could lead to misperceptions and misunderstanding in decision-making. So of course, we must ask where AI should and should not be used to begin with. AI may be great at optimizing a logistics process, but can you trust an AI system to give you reliable information to inform strategic decision-making in the nuclear domain? When, as the study specifically points out, nuclear crises are unique and exceptionally rare events. In other words, if an AI system is trained on data about how states behave in day-to-day competition, how reliable can they be in the unpredictability and the unique environment of nuclear crisis? If states aren't extremely careful about how they use AI to assist with decision-making, they may miscalculate and act in ways that are intentionally and unintentionally escalatory. Each of these potential risks is complex by itself, and the report is commendable in that it has tried to piece together how we can help understand these risks and hopefully address them. Yet, even as the survey of these potential risks is extensive, the study avoids becoming alarmist, and it makes a point to consider the opportunities to use AI to mitigate nuclear risks themselves. For instance, applications of AI to detect unusual patterns around nuclear facilities and possible insider threats could enhance nuclear safety and security. AI-enabled cybersecurity tools could help protect command, control, and communication networks. And the report argues that if done right, AI capabilities can improve our situational awareness and actually inform our decision-making, which could help us avoid miscalculation and inadvertent escalation. So this really gets to a crucial point. The impact of AI is not just a question of whether states developed and use AI capabilities, but how they do so. Is the development and use of AI guided by rigorous standards and subjected to thorough testing and evaluation? Do operators and decision makers understand the systems that they're relying upon? Do they understand how and why AI systems might fail? For these reasons, we believe it's crucial to set strong and transparent standards and principles for the development and use of AI in the military domain. This past February, our Undersecretary, Bonnie Jenkins, unveiled our framework for a political declaration on responsible military use of artificial intelligence and autonomy. We work closely with our colleagues in the Department of Defense to craft these guidelines, and we are engaging with partners around the world to build an international consensus, starting with this normative framework, to guide how militaries can responsibly incorporate AI and autonomy into their operations. These norms will help reduce the potential risks of accidents and unintended escalation and promote respect for international law, security, and stability. So relevant to this discussion of AI and nuclear operations, the declaration reiterates a commitment the United States has made, together with the United Kingdom and France, to, quote, maintain human control and involvement for all actions critical to informing and executing sovereign decisions concerning nuclear weapons employment. This statement spells out clearly what responsible states undoubtedly agree upon. Let's ensure that we maintain human control and involvement in any decision regarding the use of the most dangerous military technologies. This declaration is just one step forward toward the creation of guardrails to manage the risks and harness the benefits of AI in strategic competition. This challenge calls for creative new ideas, about how to apply both traditional arms control measures and new approaches to tailored risk reduction in the face of complexities of emerging technology. CNA has given us a lot to think about, and we need more of the thorough and sober analysis we see in this report. So let me close there by again thanking CNA for their research and work over these last 2 years. I look very much forward to the conversation and the questions, and I'm very glad and honored that the V Fund of our Bureau could have supported this important work. So thank you for asking me to speak. And again, I look forward to hearing all the excellent conversations.
Thank you so much for your introduction, Secretary Stewart. I'd now like to introduce the panel for our discussion today. Joining me here is my colleague, Dr. Timothy McDonnell. Dr. McDonnell, Tim, is a fellow research analyst and a nuclear weapons policy expert with CNA Strategy and Policy Analysis Program. Tim is the project lead and co-author of the project we're discussing today. The report is entitled Artificial Intelligence in Nuclear Operations, Challenges, Opportunities, and Impacts. This research, again, thank you, Secretary Stewart, sponsored by the State Department's ABC Bureau, and identifies areas of nuclear risks and how those risks can be affected, both exacerbated and mitigated through applications of AI. We also provide recommendations on actions responsible states can take with regard to AI and nuclear operations. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Paul Scharre. Dr. Scharre, Paul, is Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for a New American Security, commonly referred to as CNAS. He's an award-winning author of the books Army of One, as well as 4 Battlegrounds, Power in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. He also was previously in the Office of Secretary of Defense, and he played a leading role in establishing policies on unmanned and autonomous systems, including DoD Directive 3000.09. And prior to that, I want to say Paul served in the Army in the special operations with multiple tours into Iraq and Afghanistan. So thank you both for joining us today. And I'd like to start by hearing from Tim with some opening remarks on the report. Over to you, Tim.
Sure. Thank you, Larry. Thank you so much. I have a lot of thank yous to start. I want to thank Assistant Secretary Stewart and her colleagues, our points of contact in State Department Bureau of Arms Control Verification and Compliance. We've been working very closely with that office for the full duration of this project, and they've just been fantastic engaged sponsors who let us run where the research took us and enabled us to do what I think is a pretty decent piece of work. I also want to thank the whole project team. I get to be here to present what's a really big piece of collective work that involved a whole lot of people here at CNA on the project team, as well as other people providing additional support. So that includes, of course, Larry, as a key member of the project team, Anya Fink, Mary Chestnut, Tim Dittert, Analia Westerhog. We had to pull together this project team because we had to talk about 2 enormously complex technical fields. Artificial intelligence is hard and complex just by itself, and nuclear operations are hard and complex just by themselves. And so fusing that together and also looking at 3 different countries, which required English as well as 2 other language skills to understand the primary sources, was no small feat and required a lot of really excellent collaboration from a team we brought together here at CNA. So that's what it took to do what we did. Now, what did we do? The report is posted online, is lengthy. No one was expected to do homework for this. So I'm going to take a few minutes and just walk through kind of what we did and what we learned in Cliff Notes form. We started off this project, State Department Bureau of Arms Control Verification and Compliance asked us to provide research and analysis that could help them understand what it might mean if going forward, you observe that it's a known fact that the US, Russia, and PRC are all modernizing their nuclear forces. And it's reasonable to assume that as they modernize, they're going to build in cutting edge technologies to include artificial intelligence. But the details of how they do that are unclear. And even less clear was what that might mean for future nuclear risk as these three great power competitors armed with AI-enabled nuclear forces as they interact in peacetime competition, maybe war. And so to undertake that effort, we decided that a reasonable first step would be to establish a baseline. We tried to figure out what have all three countries done to date in the field of AI and nuclear operations, and what do they aspire to do going forward. And the first thing we had to do is figure out what's artificial intelligence and try to find a definition for that. And of course, that's, as all AI experts know, and I'm not one of them, but Larry tells me this and I trust him, that the definition of artificial intelligence is a contested moving target. So we adopted a broad definition. You can think back to the 1950s and 60s when computers were room size. We thought of them as artificial brains, and that was certainly not what we call artificial intelligence today. But they thought of this automation that old computers could provide as being a significant enabling capability. So we adopted this broad definition of using advanced, the most cutting edge advanced computing power for nuclear operations to see what all three countries have done in the past and what they're doing today. And the result was this thing we call this artificial intelligence implementation matrix. You don't need to squint. It's available for download online, and it's really detailed. It's thoroughly footnoted. And what it does is it breaks apart the different aspects of nuclear operations. What are in detail all the things that you might want to do with your nuclear forces? What are the challenges that you face, tasks you want to accomplish? And we tried to populate as many of the cells as we could, say, well, what has each country done to try to solve this nuclear operational problem, like targeting, like assured command and control? What has each country done? And at the end of this process, I'm not going to go into all the details because there's a lot. We stepped back and said, let's look at the whole forest, not just the trees. And we were able to discern certain, we called them on the project team proclivities, patterns of behavior that all three countries sort of followed in pretty predictable format throughout the decades. For the US, we often use the most advanced cutting edge computing technologies, AI, however understood, for two basic purposes. One is expansion of presidential decision time. So more early warning, faster dissemination of orders to allow the president more time to make extremely stressful decisions on the worst day they've ever had, as well as for damage limitation, offensive as well as defensive. Russia tends to use AI, again, broadly understood, to assure their secure second strike, as well as to expand leadership decision time. China was a tougher nut to crack. China, as Tim Ditter, the China lead for this project, would tell you if he was here, they write a lot about using artificial intelligence. They write a lot about civil military fusion. They write a lot about intelligentizing warfare, and it's about a mile wide and a half an inch deep. Unlike the US and Russia, there's not a lot, there's very, very little more in-depth discussion of exactly how that country intends to use artificial intelligence to enable its military operations broadly, and still less on the nuclear front. So there's a definite transparency gap there. So that big table, the AI implementation matrix, provided the foundation or the baseline for what all three countries were doing. And only once we sort of got there and got that foundation could we even start to think about what the future might hold. And that's what we did for the next phase of the project. That next phase of the project, and full details on our methodology and the exact, the sequence of steps that we used are available in the report, laid out in considerable detail. But that involved a lot of reading, literature review, mining existing research from the nuclear field on escalation and deterrence, and involved talking with and convening workshops with a lot of really, really smart people to try to get them to share their insights. And a lot of people gave generously to this project to help support our efforts. And what we found was, really very nicely summarized by Assistant Secretary Stewart. I don't have a whole lot to add, but I'll kind of march through as a refresher. We found that artificial intelligence is likely to have a wide range of impacts on nuclear risk. There are ways that it can increase nuclear risk. There are ways that it can reduce nuclear risk. And there are ways that, depending on the details, it'll have an uncertain impact on nuclear risk. So ways that can increase nuclear risk, there's basically three. One is just technical. You got to make sure the gizmo works, or you've got to make sure that your AI-enabled system of systems, that when two AIs or four AIs are all talking to one another, even if they weren't necessarily designed to work together, they may interact in surprising ways, and they may produce unexpected results. So there's those sort of technical issues with artificial intelligence that you just have to make sure that the systems work right. There's the probably more complicated challenge of human machine teaming, making sure that humans trust AI enough, making sure that humans understand what AI can and can't do, making sure they interact with the AI in ways that are mutually understandable, and also human skill degradation. If you start to rely on the artificial intelligence, like you rely on Google Maps to get from point A to point B, you lose your ability to navigate, you lose ability to do certain things. Then the third way that AI can increase nuclear risk is through leader calculus. And that's tougher to mitigate. It's a simple fact that if you use artificial intelligence for your nuclear operations, you're hoping that you'll get some sort of benefit from that. You may also be introducing vulnerabilities. The extent of those benefits and vulnerabilities are extremely difficult to assess in your own forces, and certainly in your opponent's forces. And so as leaders make political decisions that are rooted in part on their understanding of the nuclear balance and the military balance overall, the use of artificial intelligence will make those assessments considerably more complicated. So you've got to do your best to mitigate those challenges as best you can, especially the technology and the human machine teaming, before you can achieve benefits. If your system's not working right, if your humans and machines aren't interacting right, you're not going to be able to get benefits. But if you pass that threshold, you take that step, you get through the hoop, there are things that you can do to reduce nuclear risk. There are certain applications in nuclear operations that seem likely to reduce the risk of nuclear escalation or nuclear mission failure. Those include applications for nuclear weapons surety and security, making AI-enabled or enhanced guards, guns, and gates, survivability and resilience of nuclear forces, leadership decision time expansion, better early warning, pattern recognition, data processing to feed in decision making, more rapid orders dissemination, that sort of thing. And finally, crisis conflict de-escalation, which is a challenging application, but an option out there. And then once you've done that, there are also ways that artificial intelligence could have an uncertain impact on nuclear risk. And these are principally confined to areas where artificial intelligence could confer military advantage. And so, as in any military competition, the risk implications are, to a large extent based on how successful you are and its impact on things like crisis stability, arms race stability, inter and intra-war deterrence, and that sort of thing. And those applications can include things as mundane as operation and maintenance of nuclear forces. If you've got only a certain number of nuclear weapons and delivery systems, if you can do better predictive maintenance to keep those systems functioning at a greater percentage of the time, you get greater capability out of your size-constrained nuclear forces. Performance of both nuclear and non-nuclear forces is a big one, to the extent that if it is the case that AI-enabled non-nuclear forces start to impact the nuclear balance in important ways, that's something that would have an uncertain impact on nuclear risk. Analysis, planning, and decision support, that could be certainly an advantage, but also an Achilles heel. And finally, active air and missile defense. The proverbial shield that accompanies the nuclear sword, obviously, when used in tandem, and if AI can enhance the capabilities of your active air and missile defense, can have very important implications for the strategic nuclear balance with uncertain implications for risk. That's a lot of ground to cover. This is all detailed in much greater detail in the report, which is available online. And I think I'll probably stop there and turn it over to Larry.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. And Paul, I'm going to turn it over to you for your comments.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Larry and Tim, and congratulations to you both and the rest of your team on a fabulous report. It's very detailed and very comprehensive, assessing all of these various risks and opportunities to use some of these tools to make nuclear operations more reliable, more secure, more safe, to make sure that we're getting the best information to decision makers in a timely fashion. And I'm very excited also that the State Department is supporting this work and that they're clearly so invested in trying to better understand these challenges. Larry, you talked about these as shared challenges, and I think that's really important to keep in mind, that it's not just the US, but also other competitor nations, and what are the interactive dynamics among them, as your report talks about. That you've got a multi-layered problem here, one of which is what do countries do using this technology? And as Tim talked about, countries are going to have different approaches. We've certainly seen that in the past already with things like the Soviet Union's semi-automated dead hand system perimeter. And regardless of sort of what, the reports on this are conflicting, and regardless of sort of what you believe in terms of the details of to what extent it was ever developed or deployed, and by some accounts it was or even is still today, it's clear that Soviets pursued a type of system that US policymakers would view in a very, very different light from a risk standpoint. And as Tim talked about, there was even really less transparency about what's going on inside China, although we have seen with their nuclear buildup, certainly Chinese leadership see nuclear weapons as very relevant from a political and strategic and military calculus standpoint. And obviously, we've seen tremendous developments in AI recently. And so trying to better understand what are the risks that come with this technology is vitally important. It's worth acknowledging that in just the past few months, the US government has taken a number of really significant steps to state what the US government's policies are in this. And we've gone from a place where a year ago, the only thing that we had was some sort of remarks that US officials had made publicly, but nothing in written policy, to now policy documents coming out of both the Defense Department and the State Department in just the last few months that have a very clear policy on these issues. In the nuclear posture review, the DoD stating, and I'll paraphrase here, but that essentially there will always be a human in the loop for all actions that are critical to informing and executing a decision by the president to use or to terminate nuclear weapons employment. That's a huge policy shift. It acknowledges, I think, what has been maybe an implicit understanding by many in the US defense community that, yeah, there are lots of important applications for AI and automation, but obviously we want to make sure that humans have a tight control over nuclear weapons and any decisions about their employment or their use. But now it's official policy. And I think there's a lot to be said for that being put into official, now public guidance that the US government has put out and that other countries can see and hopefully change their calculus. And then more recently, as Assistant Secretary Mallory talked about, the State Department's political declaration spelling out, again, that same principle, as well as several others relating to military AI and how the US government intends to use this in a responsible fashion, building on lots of other work that the Defense Department has done, not just in the nuclear posture review, but in other documents like the DoD's AI principles governing military AI employment. And then the UK and France coming on board with the US to adopt similar views surrounding these issues. But we need to expand this now to more multilateral perspectives, because at the end of the day, it's also vitally important what are other countries going to do, what's Russia going to do, what's China and other nuclear powers, to get to a place where we have more stability and more safety as we see countries adopting AI technology. We want to have better clarity on what are other countries' approaches, and ideally some kind of mutual understanding about some important safeguards to have in place to ensure that there's always human control over nuclear weapons and their use, and that humans are going to be in the loop in all of these kind of key stages of informing those decisions. And that's a place where there's still a lot of work to still be done. Obviously, relations with Russia and China are extremely challenging, but I think that's the place where we need to see progress moving forward to tackle some of these shared challenges so that we can see states coming together and ideally working towards a place where we can get all the nuclear weapon states to agree to some common understanding about human control over nuclear weapons. That's absolutely critical. As we see countries integrating AI into their arsenals, that seems like sort of a bare minimum bar that we should be able to clear in terms of agreement about areas where human control is needed. Lots of debates that we've seen over the last decade about other aspects of military AI. I suspect those will continue, but this seems like a minimum threshold we should be able to get states to agree upon. And it's very important when we think about safety, when we think about how we're going to use this technology in a way, because it's not just about how states individually use it. It's also about how their actions are going to incentivize actions of others. This has been, of course, a longstanding issue in the field of nuclear stability, dating back to some of the earliest concerns about first strike stability, and what's led us to a place today where countries have invested in the architectures to have a secure second strike deterrent so that we can have a stable nuclear architecture. And we want to make sure that we're getting to the same place with military AI, and in particular, the use of AI and automation autonomy and anything related to nuclear operations. We can see in the private sector right now, these interactive dynamics are playing out in some really harmful ways. That we've seen development of large language models and then early deployments of them between OpenAI, Microsoft, and Google, of models that are clearly unsafe and are not ready to be deployed. Now, in this case, these are models that thankfully are being used in applications that are nowhere near the kinds of risks that we're talking about with nuclear operations. But it seems quite evident, and we've seen this come out in information that's come out public about internal decision making within these companies, that this competitive race among them is leading to them to cut corners on safety, to deploy things before they're ready. That's troubling in the private sector. I think it's concerning what we're seeing happening with some of these models that are inherently dual use and have a lot of beneficial applications, but also some potentially really harmful ones. But it's also a major concern among militaries who want to get ahead of those challenges and think about how can we put in safeguards today to avoid some of those interactive risks. That we're dealing with two really powerful technologies. We're in a place today where we've been able to put in safeguards that, dangerous as they are, countries have to date been able to manage nuclear weapons risk in a way that has avoided either intentional or accidental use of nuclear weapons since World War II. And we want to make sure that we can find ways to make sure that as AI is being integrated into militaries, we can also use the technology in a way that is safe and is stable. So thanks very much for inviting me to participate in this conversation. A great report, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Paul, for those great comments. I wanted to add just a reminder that we have the question and answer function. We're already getting questions, so thank you for that. If you have some questions that you haven't put in, please put them in the question and answer box, or if you even put them in chat, we have people that'll move them over. So we'd love to see those questions from you. I'm going to use my moderator prerogative and ask the first question. Which is, some in the audience may be wondering, okay, so you might say, well, if there are risks of AI in general, and if there are real risks of applying it to nuclear operations, why can't we just say no one should do this, right? So instead of in the political declaration saying, well, we're going to have human involvement in critical functions, why don't we just say, well, no AI in any nuclear operations? So what would you both say to that question? Actually, can I start with Paul?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a couple components of that, right? One would be just characterizing, what do you mean? So if we said no AI, then we got to define AI, doesn't mean it's an impossible task. And then there's actually getting everyone to agree. So I'll point out that right now, the State Department is working to try to get countries to agree to the position that the US government's taken about having human control in these critical decisions that are informing any kind of decision about nuclear weapons. We haven't seen other countries get on board that. Maybe we will. And that would be it should be an easier thing to get agreement to than an even broader prohibition saying no AI at all. So maybe if we could get there, we could talk about, is there more to be done? But that seems like at least a good place to start. But to the broader question of, what should the rule be here? There are places where automation and autonomy and artificial intelligence could be helpful. One of the things that AI could be beneficial with in terms of increasing stability among nations is providing greater transparency. And so it's easier for countries to understand what others are doing, to get visibility in what they're doing, to reduce the risk of surprise attack, to make it easier for countries to understand the relative military balance, which might lead to less miscalculation among nations, and to make it less likely that countries are able to develop weapons in secret or cheat on arms control agreements. The progress that the US government made in the run-up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, declassifying intelligence, sharing that information with other allies in Europe and elsewhere, is, I think, a great example of what this transparency can do. It didn't stop Putin's decision to invade. He wasn't going to be deterred. What it did allow was countries to come together and rally behind Ukrainian support, because the US was able to declassify intelligence and put it out there and show the world this is what Putin's trying to do, and get people to the point where they were willing to believe that this was coming, even though it was so unthinkable that he would do this, that we would now see over a year into this war, a conventional war unfolding in Europe between two states. And, that's a powerful tool to take away that element of surprise, to give countries more transparency about what others are doing. That could be very stabilizing. And that's a place where AI can help by helping to process information, to make sense of it better, whether it's for a decision about using nuclear weapons or somewhere else. And so that's one example of areas where AI could be very beneficial in terms of improving stability among countries.
Thank you so much, Paul. Tim, any further thoughts?
Sure. Yeah. I like the question a great deal because it's fundamental, and the fundamental questions are always challenging and interesting. I think there's, in addition to the challenges of definition, which are surmountable, in addition to the fact that we're already taking important public policy steps to make sure that the United States and its allies and partners are using AI responsibly. I just don't think that it is at all feasible. I wish we lived in a world where it was possible to just say no to AI. I don't think that's a reasonable thing for a couple reasons. One, this is something that's already being done. The US, Russia, and China have long been using advanced computing, and now we call that artificial intelligence, and the horizon of what is artificial intelligence is constantly moving. We've been doing this for decades. So it's not a matter of saying like, hey, here's the line, don't cross the line. We'd probably have to undo certain steps that we've already done. And that's just a very difficult thing to get anyone to agree to. Even if we could waive that problem away, I think I have a different assessment than Paul of the ability to verify such an agreement. You point out, Paul, the great success the U.S. has had in employing our intelligence capabilities to shape the information domain, sort of like fires. And that has been extremely successful. But because artificial intelligence is basically computer code, and because a lot of computer code is dual use or ambiguous use, and because it lives in black boxes, I have very low confidence in our ability to make an agreement that an agreement with a mechanism we could verify that we've all agreed that we're not going to use artificial intelligence for nuclear operations, and then we could trust our competitors to abide by that agreement. I have extremely low confidence in that. So it just, I wish we could live in a world where it was that simple, but it's not. And we just have to acknowledge that reality and live with it. And against that background, the best thing that we can do is try to mitigate risks and try to capture opportunities.
And you raise a great point. And of course, this is being hosted by the Bureau of Arms Control verification, right? So verification is a key part of this. Paul, do you have any other thoughts on this thorny issue of where does verification come into play with AI applications?
Well, I think it maybe depends on what we're trying to verify. So could AI be used as a tool to help process information, to make better sense of what others are doing? And absolutely, that is, in many ways, one of the key things that AI does. And so AI could be a valuable tool for verifying many potential arms control regimes, in the sense that it might be able to help you, track components that are being sold, and you might be able to see whether someone's trying to, acquire uranium enrichment capabilities, for example, to run centrifuges. Are there other places where AI could help you sift through documents or map, look at images more closely and then get better information on what adversaries are doing? Now, verifying AI itself is a tricky thing. And I think, as Tim talked about, like, that gets into some difficult questions about how do you verify AI capabilities. Now, on the one hand, I'll point out, to get agreement on the things that the US has already agreed to, yes, if our adversaries say they're going to do that, we'd like them to follow through on those commitments. But the US doesn't need to get to some place where we have a robust verification regime that other countries are not going to, agree to these principles for us to do. We've already adopted it. It's already US policy, right? So, for some of the things that we've already said we're going to do, we're actually out in front. I think that's a great place for the US to be. And then we want to find other ways for countries to encourage them to adopt that. There are other places beyond that where there's a whole wide scope of places where AI might be integrated into military operations and nuclear operations or others. And then it raises the questions of, okay, do you need to verify that? In some cases, it might be that you don't, because we're going to do it anyways. Or the answer might be, no, I really need to verify that. If I'm going to say I'm not going to do X, we need to know other countries are not going to do that too. So how could you do that? One model is very intrusive arms control inspection regimes. I think, as Tim points out, that's really challenging for AI because it's software. Now, there might be places where the AI capability that you're talking about is instantiated in hardware, and that becomes some mechanism. But again, if what we're talking about is you have to crack open a missile and then look on the inside and say, what's the chip that's in there, and that's pretty intrusive. Countries may not be willing to agree to that, even if it's technically possible, because of course, once you have that level of, inspectors verifying things, you're also giving away a lot of inside information about your capabilities, which is a major challenge to arms control verification. But there might be some applications where there might be other ways to verify approaches. One of those could be if the capability that we're concerned about also has some kind of observable physical instantiation. So what do I mean by that? So let's say people are really worried about military AI or autonomous weapons that are used in anti-personnel weapons, like the Slaughterbots video. People have seen it. I'm not a big fan of the video, to be honest, but I think it characterizes this fear, these drones flying around and attacking people. And that's a place where you can point to the physical characteristics you're looking for. And that's a different kind of physical system than, say, a large combat drone that's used to go after radars or some other military object. Well, we have actually examples of other arms control regimes that do this. This is what the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty did and the Missile Technology Control Regime do, where while they're aimed at WMD-capable missiles, they actually just capture the physical capabilities of all missiles, because that's something that's observable, rather than saying you can build missiles of a certain type that have conventional warheads but not nuclear ones, because that's hard to verify, right? To know what's inside the missile itself. So, there are potential approaches here. One other one that's worth maybe flagging is that we have seen the development of these very large scale models for AI, like ChatGPT and its more recent successor, GPT-4. They use massive amounts of computing hardware. The US has already put in place export controls on chips going to China for the most advanced chips that are used in some of these things. And if that continues to be a sort of control point over access to this technology, that could be a potential avenue for even a non-proliferation regime, where you don't have to get other countries to agree. China does not agree to the export controls the US government's put in place to deny someone access to a capability if using large amounts of these very advanced chips continues to be really a requirement for accessing the most capable AI systems. So I think there are a number of areas that are worth exploring here. It's a really tough problem. I don't want to gloss over it, but there might be some particular applications where we might be able to think about verifying what someone else is doing using military AI.
Yeah, so Paul, I want to build on two of the points that you made, both framed in what's observable, what can you see? So I think we're in agreement that banning artificial intelligence is not verifiable writ large. However, there are things that you can do to observe certain categories of behavior. So you might have a narrower ban or a narrower restriction on some AI applications. Crucially, those wouldn't necessarily be the most dangerous or most destabilizing applications. You'd just be limited to what you can observe. So you'd have to kind of crosswalk, what am I most worried about? What can I see? An example that comes to mind is back during the Cold War, during the late 1960s and early 1970s, when the US and the Soviets were both exploring MIRVing. The challenge there was knowing, have they MIRVed yet or not? And as it is the same basic problem. You have to have a really invasive inspection regime to know, hey, how many RVs or reentry vehicles are on the nose cone of that weapon. But you can observe MIRV testing. MIRV testing looks different if your adversary tests a MIRV weapon. It looks different from a single reentry vehicle test. And so, based on what we could observe, we were able to keep track of at least, when they cross the threshold, they have a capability that they did not have before. They could do the same for us. So thinking in terms of what you can observe, and then, have they crossed a threshold, at least gives you a gross way of thinking about limiting AI applications in the nuclear space. Although, again, those aren't necessarily going to be the most dangerous or most risky applications. That's just going to be what you can observe. The other point you made, the second point you made, was, reminded me of, as you highlighted, the nuclear non-proliferation regime. You can have export controls and they can be extremely useful, and that can be desirable. But you use the phrase deny, and I think I would frame it more as delaying. If a country is really, really bound and determined to acquire a certain capability, export controls can be useful for delaying those efforts and stymieing those efforts, but they will, if it's a big, tough, wealthy nation state with a large population that has university graduates and programs, things like that, if they want it, they'll get it eventually. And so maybe we have to live in the world of partial success, delays, half measures, and just do the best we can, muddle them through.
Great. Well, great exchange. We had a number of questions now. As we talk about some of these things, do we have a solid grasp on what Russia and China are doing? And to the extent that we do, what do we see as the key differences?
Define solid. We have a general grasp of the sorts of things that Russia has done. I don't want to say they're transparent. They're certainly not as transparent as the United States, but they have academic writings. I wish my colleague who led this slice of the study, Anya Fink, were here. She could give you a more fulsome answer, but we have a reasonably good notion of the sorts of things that they have done in the past and think about doing in the future. That is far less the case with China.
Okay, so we have lots of questions. So another question from Stratcom: how do we create a, quote, bright line of habits and trust that we see U.S. allied and adversary military and government officials have with AI? And related to that, how do they shape their level of comfort for AI technology applied to decision making? So maybe Paul, start with you.
Sure. I think it's if a person's default response is like, I'm not sure if I trust this AI thing, that's not a bad place to be, because a lot of these systems are not reliable. They're not robust. They are subject to, sort of strange behaviors. If the circumstances change, they're often very brittle in terms of their performance. And then, of course, they're subject also to adversarial attacks or methods of hacking them. And we've already seen this in things like deployments of self-driving cars, where you can have an autonomous system that does very well in some settings. And then there's some slight change in the environment. There's a change in the lighting, or it comes across a circumstance it hasn't seen before. And the system goes from very safe to very dangerous in an instant. And so, what we really want is well-calibrated trust where people understand the capabilities of these systems and their limitations and know when to trust it and when not to. And so as we think about what human machine teaming looks like with AI systems, it's worth keeping in mind we have human machine teaming with physical systems now. We have very complex physical systems that military service members operate, whether it's aircraft or submarines or ships or tanks. And the people who operate these systems have a great feel for their creaks and groans and when it needs attention and what it could do and how far you can push these systems. We need to get to that place with artificial intelligence too, in part because the way these systems operate is not like human intelligence. And that's a real risk sometimes when we're using AI systems, is our natural tendency is to sort of take this mental model that we have of a person and how a person thinks that we use to interact and talk with others every day. And then we apply it to this AI system, like, oh, it seems like it's a good driver, so I can trust it. Like, well, in some settings, maybe, some settings, maybe not. Where it seems like it's good at this task, I think it's going to be good at related tasks, and it may not be, or may fail in different ways than people. And so I think, getting that experience, getting these tools in people's hands, it's not going to happen looking at PowerPoint slides. We got to build these tools. But then when we start using them, some degree of caution is probably a good thing.
Yeah, Paul, I think I concur. Healthy skepticism is, if you're going to be wrong in one direction, too much trust, too little trust, healthy skepticism is probably a wise posture. On the topic of bright lines, where should we draw lines in terms of decision support? Your recent War on the Rocks piece on the AI's inhuman advantage got me thinking here, and this is not we didn't push this far in the report, so I'm just speaking for myself and kind of shooting from the hip here. But we talk about AI for decision support, and once upon a time I asked Larry, I don't know what that means. Can you explain it to me? And your clear, helpful explanation for me was, well, Tim, you know how a military staff works. That you got the Napoleonic system. You 1, 2, 3 is ops, 5 is plan, so on and so forth. Decision support, would do things that a staff might do for a leader. I said, okay. Against that background, that sort of probably dramatic oversimplification of a complex issue area, your AI's inhuman advantage article got me thinking. You argued that because AI thinks very differently from a human and acts very differently from a human, it can seem very difficult to comprehend what it's doing, why it made that chess move when it's adopting a strategy that no human would adopt. And within the context of the game, it actually makes sense, but we just don't understand it until 17 moves later. That seems like that holds a very important lesson for how we use artificial intelligence for decision support. In other words, deterrence is a phenomenon that takes place in the mind of your opponent. And so if your opponent is augmented by or backed by an artificial intelligence staff that thinks differently from humans, that it becomes a lot harder to deter that opponent because you don't understand how their decision making is going to work. The human machine team kind of becomes a black box in the same way that an AI is a black box. So maybe a reasonable rule, and again, I'm just shooting from the hip here, might be to think about using, in the nuclear space, you can use artificial intelligence for decision support in the way that you might, have a very junior member of a staff do the sort of data aggregation that a clerk might do. But when you would turn on your military staff to the skills of a planner or a targeter, or some of those really higher level functions, that should still be a human. And that's certainly within in keeping with the trajectory of US policy. It just hasn't been stated that explicitly yet. So that's just one hypothesis.
Yeah, kind of building on that point, and I really appreciate that article too. It kind of goes back to trust Paul, as you said, for calibrated trust, appropriate trust, right? It's like, too much and he's Goldilocks trust.
Yeah.
Not too much, not too little. But that's actually really hard. So I recall, and you probably saw this too, in Iraq and Afghanistan, we fielded all this technology in the field. And so these commanders and operators would now have this capability. And so some of them had seen it before. And so they're like, oh, I know exactly what I can do with this. And they would just, use it beautifully. Others would say, I don't know what this is, but I'll try it. And they would use it and it would be used poorly, right? Kind of wasted. And then some people would say, I don't know what this is. I'm not going to use it. And it would stay in the container, right? So it's all, really there's lots of different outcomes depending on your, both your trust, if it's calibrated or not, and your kind of willingness to use this. But it also gets to the point, I think there's an angle here about, the inhuman part, right? And this goes back to that famous Go move, where it did something that was just totally unexpected and just unexplainable. And there's both the challenge there that, like, how do we build trust in a system that is doing things that we just don't understand? But there's also like a strategic element of, like, can we get it to do that to others, right? Like, I mean, that could be really a powerful, a strategy to have that ability. But that also requires us to really understand that system in a very deep way. So I appreciate this conversation because it's great points. So,
Well, I think it's great, the points that both of you are making. I mean, there's been for a while this challenge when we think about automation and autonomy speeding up military operations, where you want to get inside the enemy's OODA loop and you want to find ways to use automation to do that, but you don't want your forces inside your own OODA loop, right? You don't want these forces making these automated decisions and then maybe it's doing something you don't want it to do. And so that's a tension that exists in automation. And I think what your comments made me think of, Larry, and I think highlights this tension also exists in when you start tapping into the potential of AI to explore new strategies, as we've seen it done in games like chess and Go or poker, where AI is sort of really widely expanding the space of possible ways to play these games, and humans are learning from them. There's opportunities for that in warfare, but we wanted to be doing the strange, unpredictable, surprising things to the enemy, not things that are surprising to us. And that is a very real tension we're going to have to deal with these technologies.
It seems like a useful heuristic to me, exactly as you said. There's basically two dimensions here of variation. One is what I'd call difference in degree. How fast are the things that you'd ordinarily be doing? How fast are they happening? And then there's the difference in kind. Does this change the nature of conflict? And to some extent, a great enough change in speed can amount to a change in kind. But I think those are two different. It's useful to disaggregate those two dimensions in terms of how you think about the impacts of AI on warfare. And changes in speed, I think, are a lot more manageable than changes in kind.
Yeah, one of the interesting things to me about the way that AI has been used in games, for example, is not surprisingly, these AI agents can move much, much faster than humans. And so in gaming environments, like in computer or strategy games like StarCraft or Dota 2, they dumb down the AI agents. Because if you let them operate unconstrained, they're basically invincible. They're able to dodge enemy fire in these computer games. But that's not the purpose of using the AI in the game. They're trying to train the AI system to do higher level planning and strategic decision-making. So they try to level the playing field with human reaction time. But when you think about it in the military context, as you're pointing out, Tim, these benefits may be seen very differently, where something that is simple and gives an unfair advantage is, of course, exactly what we're looking for. And if it's transparent and we know what it's doing, okay, it's just moving faster, that might be something that the military embraces because we can understand it, we can see the potential. Whereas kind of like it's this black box and it makes some spooky, weird decision, and then maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, I don't know. That kind of surprising move that AlphaGo made that AlphaGo calculated was a 1 in 10,000 move that a human would have made that. So this really kind of alien inhuman move. Militaries may be justifiably a little bit more skeptical of that kind of use of AI.
Yeah, great points. So, some more questions. One is involving AI-driven escalation. So, one question is escalation using conventional AI applications, which is kind of a little bit different. So, could the use of AI in conventional capabilities change the strategic calculations that then affect our nuclear options? So, Tim, any thoughts?
Yes, I think it certainly has that potential. As we've seen over the last several decades, we're deep into the precision guided munition revolution. Conventional precision guided munitions have the ability to attack nuclear relevant targets, things like early warning radars and bomber bases and things like that. That's a capability that exists. Those conventional capabilities, even without any kind of artificial intelligence, can have a shaping effect on the nuclear balance, the military balance, and opponent perceptions of those balances can shape their decision making. So I think it's not a very far intellectual leap to imagine that if you apply AI to your conventional capabilities, that it could have a corresponding impact on nuclear escalation risk. Although I would add that assessing what that risk is gets more complicated because you're using AI. Maybe your whiz-bang gizmo is going to make your conventional forces a lot better and more threatening to your opponent's nuclear forces. Or maybe it introduces a new vulnerability or a new attack surface that they can use to make it so you can't use those conventional forces or make them less effective that wouldn't have existed if you didn't build in that, AI-based vulnerability or backdoor that they can use for, hacking or something like that. As in all things, there's a competitive two-way dynamic, and both opponents are going to try to pursue whatever advantages they can, and AI can be both an advantage as well as a disadvantage. Sorry, it's complicated. Paul?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And there's a couple ways that you could envision AI potentially in the conventional space being used in ways that might be damaging to stability in the nuclear space. So one could be if a AI enabled one country to have a sort of better conventional advantage that caused other countries to rely more heavily on nuclear weapons as their deterrent. And that's, of course, was the original U.S. sort of first offset early in the Cold War, the U.S. relying on nuclear weapons to counter the Soviet Union's conventional advantage in terms of its just much larger size and posture in Europe. So that's one concern, that AI could give a country a leg up and cause others to lean more heavily on nuclear weapons. Another concern could be that AI causes a conventional conflict to escalate in a way that might cause a country to look towards nuclear weapons. So even if it's not that AI, leads directly to, then there's some nuclear launch. Imagine you have autonomous weapons that go awry or attack the wrong targets, and then another country feels that it's threatened their nuclear deterrent in some way. It's gone after, their command and control, for example, that either is nuclear specific or maybe even dual use, and that causes a country to think more heavily about using nuclear weapons. And a third potential avenue of concern could simply be that if conventional uses of AI just, increased instability risk, it made it more likely that there were, accidents or ways that countries might initiate conflict. You could see greater risk of conflict among nuclear powers, even in the conventional space, but of course that would itself, carry, second order risk in the nuclear space, right? So if an autonomous, totally conventional autonomous drone in the air or at sea by the US or China had some incident in the middle of a crisis, that could lead to some escalation between the US and China, and if that made it, easier for a country to use an excuse to go to war, or they felt that they maybe needed to respond to some escalation for domestic reasons, that could itself be troubling if it, leads to some kind of conflict among nuclear powers. So I think there's a lot of room to be concerned and a lot of areas to pay close attention to, even if it's not directly in nuclear operations.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, Paul, and I'd add, to return to our earlier discussion on changes in degree, changes in kind. I think there's also a risk that, to the extent that, if it is the case that artificial intelligence increases the pace of conventional conflict, that leaves less time for people on both sides of the equation to make decisions. And I know from my own personal experience that when I'm in a real hurry, I tend to make stupider decisions than when I have more time. And that's not something you want in a high-end conventional conflict at the cusp of becoming nuclear.
So we have another question about generational and cultural experience and relative comfort with technology, as well as a risk of miscalculation. So any thoughts on kind of like the younger generation versus older generation that may have different different proclivities in terms of miscalculation? So,
you're looking at me like I've been about 75 years old since I was about 16, and I'm a little bit of a Luddite, so I'm not sure that I'm the best person to answer this question. I think there's certainly reason to think through all sorts of, as you think about the problem of human machine teaming, generation gaps are one dimension of that challenge. But I think it's probably more helpful, more analytically useful and more operationally useful to frame it in terms of tech savvy. And you can't always assume that the youths are going to be more tech savvy than the olds, because that's just not necessarily true. But if you think about who's been trained on the system, who's got experience working with the system, and who doesn't, that seems like the more useful operational way of dealing with the human machine team challenges that the questioner raised, than sort of a simple age-based heuristic. I think if you were to ask me to operate most AI systems, I would probably struggle. And there are certainly people who are older than me, including yourself and Paul, who I assume is older than me, I'm not sure, who would operate it very skillfully by comparison.
Yep. Paul, any thoughts?
Yeah, I do think your question made me think. I think somehow we're the other side of this age divide, Larry, and it makes me wonder, when did that happen? But I think Tim makes a great point that we're really talking is about tech savvy. One of the things that I think is encouraging here is, in spite of the fact that I think some of the specific deployments we're seeing out in the private sector of large language models are, not wise. We are going to see this huge influx of AI, whether it's generative tools to do, create art or to write text or other things, in a whole wide range of applications, Microsoft embedding some of these tools into Office applications. And that, I think, is going to help give people a better intuitive sense for what these tools can do. And so, despite the moral panic about what, ChatGPT is going to do to college essays or whatever, I think it's good that people are, leaning into trying to use these tools. We need to better understand where are there harms from them. People need to learn, sometimes it makes something up. And, I think the more that people actually interact with these systems, we can build up that tech savviness and then intuitive understanding that's going to be really critical in the most high-risk applications.
Yeah, great point. And I also sympathize about the age issue. So kind of pivoting a little bit to, okay, so what should we do? And actually, I think, thinking about the human machine teaming, right? Which I think this question really gets to the point that, there is no one human machine team. It is really, I mean, every person brings their own characteristics into this, right? So it's really going to be lots of variability, both in the hardware, software, but also even in the people and how they deal with it. So it's going to be complex. And how do we effectively address risk, right? So as we think about, okay, so we have this technology, we think it's going to be used, we think there are applications that really will bring value to this, but how do we do it in a responsible way? I think going beyond, okay, we acknowledge that having human control on these critical functions is a foundational starting point, but what else, like in the next 10 minutes, like what else should we be doing? And how should we be doing it? Like, how much should it be us? How much should we be trying to work on common ground with others? I'd love both of your thoughts, and maybe Tim can start off.
Sure. Yeah. I'm happy to take a stab at it. We've got recommendations in the report, and they basically you think of them as concentric circles. You start with focused risk mitigation on AI applications to nuclear operations, because that's really where that's the centerpiece of the problem that we're here to look at. And we've identified a number of those risks, and we've got some reasonable, if broad, ways ahead to mitigate them. Make sure your tech works right, make sure that the systems of systems are going to interact nicely and predictably. Make sure your human machine teams are good. Make sure your training data is appropriate to the task you ask the AI to perform, and all of those things. And the good news here is that as my experience with the U.S. nuclear community and policy and operations is that this is a community of small c conservative people. Belt and suspenders. You could, if you wanted to, you could tell DoD or Stratcom, guys, you have carte blanche to use AI for your nuclear operations in any way you want, and there would be no. I predict there would be no rush to Best Buy to get your latest Chat GPT or what have you. They would take a very conservative, very measured approach, because it's a belt and suspenders community where perfection is the standard. So I think I'm comfortable that there will be continue to be a cautious approach here, as they do things like acquisitions and things like that. Then the next concentric circle is you look at AI applications to military uses more broadly. That's because we talked about how the conventional applications can impact the nuclear balance and things like that, but also because conventional military operations are more widespread and more common. So you can learn important lessons. If you certainly don't want accidents or bad things to happen, but if you make a mistake with a conventional weapon, the consequences are far lower than if you make a mistake with a nuclear weapon. So there'll probably be a certain amount of learning there from the conventional domain. And then third is we need to explore fundamental research of AI-related risks. We've talked about how AI can be inhuman, can act in inhuman ways, can act in ways we don't understand. Fundamental research on exactly what happens in those black boxes can help us get a better understanding of their capabilities and limitations, and help us make smarter choices about where we should and shouldn't use them.
Sure. Thank you. Paul, love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth acknowledging how far the DoD has come on these issues of military AI in the last few years. We've seen tremendous progress on the policy side, where DoD's put out AI ethics principles, responsible AI guidelines coming out of the Defense Innovation Unit, and then in just the last year, responsible AI strategy coming out of the department, this language in the Nuclear Posture Review, update to the DoD directive on autonomy in weapons, and then over at the State Department, this political declaration on military AI. So I think on the policy side, the DoD has done a tremendous amount to put in place the intellectual framework to think about how are we going to approach AI in the military space, and to do so in a way that's responsible and safe. What's missing is now implementation. And that's, I think, where DoD is coming up short in many cases, I think some big ways. Now, we don't want to be rushing to implement AI into nuclear operations. And I agree with Tim, people aren't going to be, that's not the operators want to do there anyways. But in other applications, DoD is moving pretty slowly. We're 5 years now into Project Maven, and that's underway. It's doing well, but beyond that, DoD's got a lot of small pilot projects, but I don't think we've seen a lot of large-scale implementation of AI inside the department. Obviously, DoD's had some struggles in terms of organizing itself, standing up the Jake being subsumed into the new CDAO. That's been around over a year now. And so that's an area where I do think DoD needs to find ways to move faster, because we can write all the right policy documents and have all the right approaches, but in order to be able to figure out how do we use AI effectively and safely, we got to build it and we got to deploy it, right? You can only learn so much about flying an airplane safely by writing down things on paper. You got to build airplanes and you got to put them up in the sky and you got to figure out how to use them. We've got to do the same with AI and get AI off the PowerPoint slides and into the real world. And when you do so in a way that's focused on safety and assurance, but we also have to build these systems in order to know how to use them effectively.
Yeah, Paul, great point. Actually, that reminds me of something that that I think you've also observed. If you look at the responsible AI approach and the AI ethical principles, they provide a lot of insight into like how you build things in the first place and how you move them into the field. But there's not anything about a feedback loop. Like what if you start seeing problems? In other parts of DoD, sometimes the safety process will work, but honestly, it's kind of weak. And so I actually saw, I think you wrote something with Mike Horowitz that was talking about like a tracking process for like if you have AI related mishaps, you start tracking them and using them for learning. I thought that was a great point, and that we've seen in some other places within DoD, but not in this space. So I'd just love to hear you respond to that point.
I think it's a great point, because AI is going to require a different approach than how we think about traditional testing for weapon systems, where normally we write the requirements, we go build the system, and then we test it. Okay, did it meet the requirements before deploying it? And the problem with AI systems is that we're going to see strange things in a real world deployment. This is the case for all AI systems because we can't test against all of the possible permutations of how it's going to interact with the environment. AI systems can often prove quite brittle. They're not very robust to these changes in the environment or to the data it's receiving. And so we should expect that to happen. And we know in some cases it has. So DoD has talked publicly about Project Maven. When they first deployed it, that the performance dropped off dramatically in the real world from testing. It's entirely expected. That we should expect that would happen with most AI systems when we take them out of the lab and put them in a real world environment, military or otherwise. And now what DoD did was have tight integration between engineers and operators, and they were able to update the algorithm multiple times within that first week of deployment. And so just on a daily basis, taking information happening out in the operating environment, feeding that in, making changes, updating the system. That's really important for AI systems to succeed, but that's not normally how we tend to think about doing this. And so that's going to require some different approaches, maybe even unlocking some different tools in terms of things like funding for contracts for how we're going to be having this continual process of testing and upgrading these systems to make them safe and effective.
Yeah, Paul, I like that way of thinking. And although it occurs to me that the dynamism in AI development, you bring it to the field, expect it to fail, but during that first week, you can make a lot of updates, is great and can improve effectiveness, can improve safety. But in terms of, capturing those lessons learned that you were talking about, makes it a challenge. A lesson you learned from like version 1.27, once you patched it, it may not apply to 1.28. And just as we do all of these software updates, making sure that you're keeping track of all your lessons learned, that they're they're captured in a usable, searchable way for busy operators who aren't going to, take time to go through the entire version history and the associated, safety rules associated with that. And then thinking about how your AI-enabled system of systems is going to work together when you're not exactly sure what software package any of these different systems might be running at the given moment. The work of actually taking those lessons learned and making them useful to an operator sounds extremely difficult. It's doable. We'll figure it out, but I'm not exactly sure how yet.
Yeah, and building on that, Paul, I think your point of I'd heard that as well about the Maven project and how they were doing this very quick. They were just adapting, right? Adapting on the fly, learning these lessons. But where are the lessons? Because if other efforts are going to do this, do they have to go through the very same process, or can we somehow find these things and make ourselves better so that the baseline we build upon is better over time? So, which I think we definitely want to do in non-nuclear applications first before we go to the nuclear. So, anyway, so this has been a fabulous discussion. My one regret is that we have so many questions we just can't get to just because of time. But I'm really thankful. Thank you for the audience, and thankful for the two panelists and this really rich discussion on this topic. This is important, right? This is not a trivial application, and as DoD has already, both DoD and state have really put in a lot of thought into this, right? And that's commendable. But Paul, as you say, there's a lot of work left to do, and we want to make that work count the best we can. So thank you to all of you, and I look forward to seeing you in our next national security seminar. Thanks.
Thank you.